The night of December 24, 1979, was colder than usual in Kabul. The air was sharp, carrying the metallic scent of snow as Soviet armored columns rolled through the darkened streets. The ground trembled beneath the tracks of tanks. Helicopter blades beat rhythm into the sky. For those who woke to the sound of engines, it was a night they would never forget. Afghanistan had been invaded. Inside the presidential palace, Hafiz al-Amin paced like a man already haunted. Amin had seized power only months before, but his rule was fragile, propped up by purges and fear. Rumors whispered through Kabul that he was about to be betrayed, but Amin dismissed them. He trusted his guards, his palace walls, and the promises of Moscow. He didn't know that even as he moved restlessly through the grand halls, Soviet commandos were closing in. When the assault began, it was sudden and merciless. Silenced weapons cracked, grenades burst, and tracer fire slashed across the palace grounds. Amin's guards fought, but they were overwhelmed. By the time the sun rose, Amin was dead. The Soviets had replaced him with Babrak Karmal, a man they believed would bend obediently to Moscow's will. What the Kremlin imagined would be a brief, decisive intervention, swift and bloodless, became something else entirely. Afghanistan, scarred by centuries of invasion and resistance, was about to swallow another empire. Far from the palaces of Kabul, in mountain villages where mud brick houses clung to cliffsides, news of the invasion spread with fury. Old men remembered past wars. The British had come twice in the 19th century and been driven back. Now another foreign army marched through Afghan valleys. In smoky rooms lit by kerosene lamps, elders gathered young men and told them the duty was clear: take up arms, resist, fight until the invader was gone. At first, the resistance was scattered. Farmers carried ancient rifles, left over from older wars, weapons that jammed as often as they fired. Bands of fighters ambushed Soviet patrols and melted back into the mountains. Women carried food and messages. Children served as lookouts, whistling when convoys approached. It was not yet an army, but it was a spark. In Washington, the spark was seen as an opportunity. The invasion shocked the Carter administration. The president, grave-faced and tired from the Iranian hostage crisis, listened as his advisors explained what had happened. The Soviets now occupied Afghanistan, a poor country, yes, but one bordering Iran, Pakistan, and within reach of the oil routes of the Persian Gulf. To Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the meaning was clear. This wasn't just about Afghanistan. This was about the Cold War balance of power. Brzezinski leaned across the table, voice sharp, eyes alight with conviction. Mr. President, he said, this is our chance. The Soviets have stepped into a trap. We must make Afghanistan their Vietnam. What he meant was simple. America would not send soldiers. It would send money, weapons, and training, indirectly, secretly. Afghans would fight and die, but the Soviets would bleed. Out of this idea came Operation Cyclone, a program that would grow into the most expensive covert war in CIA history. At first, it was small. A few $1 million in weapons, funneled quietly into Pakistan. Crates of rifles and ammunition bought on the global black market. Suitcases of cash exchanged in safe houses in Islamabad. But even in these early days, the stakes were already enormous. Pakistan was the key. General Zia ul-Haq, the country's military dictator, welcomed the plan. Through his intelligence service, the ISI, money and weapons would flow into Afghanistan. But Pakistan had its own vision. The ISI would decide which Afghan factions were supported, and which were left to wither. They favored Islamist groups, men like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who dreamed not just of driving out the Soviets, but of reshaping Afghanistan itself under hardline religious rule. Washington knew this but chose to look away. For now, the enemy was Moscow, and any ally, no matter how extreme, was welcome. In the mountains, Afghan fighters began to notice changes. A new rifle here, a better supply of ammunition there. Fighters who had once carried rusted Lee Enfields now had Kalashnikovs. The difference was life or death. An ambush in the Kunar Valley in 1980 left an entire Soviet patrol destroyed, their vehicles burning, their weapons stripped and carried off as trophies. The rebels whispered to each other, someone out there wanted him to win. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers wrote home in despair. Letters smuggled back to Moscow spoke of villages that greeted them not with gratitude, but with hatred. "The children throw stones at us," one conscript wrote. "They spit and call us infidels. Every alley hides a gun. Every old woman looks at us as if we have murdered her son." The Red Army fought with overwhelming force. Helicopter gunships strafed valleys, convoys of tanks thundered through mountain passes, villages suspected of harboring guerrillas were reduced to rubble. Yet for every Mujahid killed, more seemed to rise. The Soviets controlled the cities, but the countryside slipped further from their grasp. By 1981, the CIA's involvement was no longer cautious. Ronald Reagan had entered the White House, promising to confront the Soviet Union at every frontier. Afghanistan became a symbol of that struggle. Reagan's rhetoric painted the Mujahideen as heroes of freedom, warriors resisting tyranny. He met their leaders, shook their hands, and pledged support. To the American public, Afghanistan became not just a faraway war, but a cause. But for Afghans, it was not ideology. It was survival. Imagine a village in the Panjshir Valley in 1982. Snow lies heavy on the mountains. Soviet columns have tried and failed to capture the valley 5 times already. Ahmad Shah Massoud, the young commander known as the Lion of Panjshir, walks among his men. They are tired, their boots worn, their weapons mismatched. But they trust him. Massoud knows the ridges, the paths, the places where ambushes can bleed the Soviets dry. That morning, Soviet helicopters rise over the mountains, their blades chopping the air. Bombs fall on the village, houses splinter, fire spreads. But in the passes above, Massoud's men wait, hidden among rocks. As the Soviet infantry climbs, the Mujahideen strike, unleashing volleys of fire that echo through the valley. The Soviets retreat again, battered and humiliated. For the people of Panjshir, it is another proof that the invader can be resisted. In Islamabad, CIA offices watch maps with pins marking Soviet convoys destroyed, outposts overrun, ambushes successful. The numbers are still small, but they are growing. The Americans feel vindicated. Brzezinski's vision is working. But even in these early years, shadows lengthen. Not all Mujahideen are alike. Some dream of a free Afghanistan, others of an Islamic emirate. Some answer only to tribal elders, others to radical clerics. The money flowing in does not unite them, it deepens divisions. Yet Washington doesn't care. Unity is a problem for later. For now, what matters is that Soviet soldiers are dying. And die they do. By 1983, thousands of Red Army troops have been killed, tens of thousands wounded. Soviet mothers received coffins wrapped in secrecy, told their sons perished on international duty. The truth, that their children were dying in a war no one wanted, is whispered only in kitchens and cemeteries. But in Afghanistan, the war is no whisper. It is the roar of helicopters, the thunder of artillery, the crack of rifles fired from behind boulders. It is children growing up knowing only war, men hardening into fighters, women burying husbands and sons. It is a nation becoming a battlefield, piece by piece. And the CIA watches, calculating, investing, planning for the next move. By 1984, the war in Afghanistan had entered a darker, bloodier phase. The Soviets were dug in, committed, and desperate to crush the rebellion that refused to die. Their convoys still rumbled through dusty valleys, their helicopters still circled above the jagged mountains, but the illusion of control was slipping away. For every village they pacified, another flared into resistance. For every mujahid they killed, two more seemed to rise from the ruins. In Washington, the war had become a symbol. President Ronald Reagan spoke often of the Afghan resistance, calling the Mujahideen freedom fighters. In his speeches, they were cast as noble warriors defending their homeland against godless tyranny. Cameras captured Reagan meeting Afghan leaders in the White House, smiling as he shook their hands, presenting them as heroes to the American people. Few Americans knew their names, their factions, or their rivalries. What mattered was the image, a small, poor nation defying the Soviet Empire. The truth on the ground was far messier. The Mujahideen were not one army, but many. Commanders squabbled over territory, loyalty shifting with every shipment of weapons. In Pakistan, the ISI distributed American aid not equally, but strategically. Islamist commanders like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar were showered with money and arms, while others, more moderate, less radical, were pushed aside. For the CIA, these were small details. They didn't care who fired the bullets, so long as the bullets struck Soviet soldiers. But even with streams of rifles and cash, the Mujahideen remained outgunned. The Soviet Union still had the skies. Helicopter gunships roared through valleys, spraying rockets into villages. Jets dropped bombs with mechanical indifference. For every ambush the Mujahideen staged, for every patrol they annihilated, Soviet airpower returned the next day to burn crops, level homes, and scatter refugees. And yet, even in this unequal war, stories of defiance spread like wildfire. In the Panjshir Valley, Ahmad Shah Massoud fought battle after battle, outmaneuvering Soviet offensives again and again. His men dug tunnels, stockpiled weapons, and vanished into caves when airstrikes came. Time after time, the Soviets declared Massoud defeated, only for him to reappear, stronger than before. His legend grew, not just in Afghanistan but abroad, whispered about in CIA briefings and intelligence reports. Still, the Soviets had numbers. By 1985, over 100,000 Soviet troops were deployed in Afghanistan. Convoys snaked through the deserts, engineers mined mountain passes, and armored vehicles stood guard over garrisons. But for every soldier in uniform, there was a boy far from home, writing letters filled with despair. "Mother," one conscript wrote from Kandahar, "they told us we were coming to help our Afghan brothers. But the people here spit at us. Even the children throw stones. Every alley hides a rifle. Every night we hear gunfire. I do not know if I will return." Back in Moscow, coffins arrived in steady streams. They were called zinc coffins, sealed and anonymous, delivered to grieving families who were told little more than that their sons had died on international duty. By 1985, tens of thousands of Soviet casualties had accumulated. Afghanistan was becoming the wound no one could hide. It was in this moment that the CIA made its boldest move. For years, American officers had studied the problem. The Mujahideen could fight bravely, they could strike from the shadows, but they were always vulnerable to Soviet aircraft. Helicopters in particular, Mi-24 Heinz, hulking machines bristling with rockets and guns, were nightmares for guerrilla fighters. They could descend on villages with terrifying speed, annihilate convoys in seconds, and vanish back into the sky. The CIA's answer was a weapon few in Afghanistan had ever seen, the FIM-92 Stinger missile. Portable, heat-seeking, fired from the shoulder of a single man, it was designed to track the heat of an aircraft's engine and strike with deadly precision. A fighter who had once hidden from helicopters could now stand his ground, aim, and bring a machine worth millions crashing into the earth. The first Stingers arrived in 1986. At first, there was doubt. Could Afghan fighters, many with little formal training, really use such advanced technology? But the results came quickly. In the mountains near Jalalabad, a group of Mujahideen fighters raised their weapons as a pair of Soviet helicopters approached. For years, those helicopters had terrorized the valley. This time, they didn't make it back. A missile whooshed skyward, curved, and struck. The explosion echoed through the mountains. Wreckage rained down. The fighters cheered. The Soviets, for the first time, were afraid of the sky. News of the stingers spread quickly, carried in whispers and boasts. Within months, dozens of Soviet aircraft were destroyed. Pilots began flying higher, avoiding low passes. Helicopter missions were cancelled. Entire strategies were abandoned. A single weapon had shifted the balance of the war. One CIA officer later admitted, the Stinger turned Afghanistan into the Soviets' Vietnam. But for Afghans, it was not a simple story of victory. Villages still burned. Landmines, scattered across fields and paths, maimed children daily. Millions of Afghans fled across borders into Pakistan and Iran, filling refugee camps with faces of exhaustion and despair. Inside those camps, young boys grew up learning not arithmetic or poetry, but war. They were taught to handle rifles before they could read, to chant slogans before they could write their names. An entire generation was being shaped not by peace, but by conflict. Meanwhile, in Washington, Afghanistan was hailed as a triumph of covert war. Reagan doubled down, pouring more money into Operation Cyclone. The Mujahideen were held up as proof that communism could be resisted, that Soviet power could be broken. Photographs of Afghan fighters shaking Reagan's hand were splashed across newspapers. Few noticed that those same fighters sometimes killed each other, shelled rival factions, or terrorized civilians. By 1987, Soviet morale was collapsing. Gorbachev, the reformist leader in Moscow, called Afghanistan a bleeding wound. The war was costing billions the Soviet economy could not afford. Soldiers returned home broken, drug-addicted, traumatized. Mothers formed committees, demanding to know why their sons were being buried in zinc coffins. Inside the Kremlin, the truth was unavoidable: the war was unwinnable. In 1988, after nearly a decade of bloodshed, the Soviets signed the Geneva Accords. Their withdrawal began soon after. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet tank crossed the Friendship Bridge into Uzbekistan. General Boris Gromov, the commander of the Soviet forces, walked across on foot, later declaring bitterly, "Not one Soviet soldier is left behind me." The Mujahideen celebrated. For them, it was a victory against a superpower. For the CIA, it was proof that a covert war, fought with dollars and weapons instead of American lives, could topple even the Soviet Union. But Afghanistan itself was left in ruins. Its cities were shattered, its villages hollowed, its people scattered across borders. The Soviets were gone, but peace did not come with them. The weapons remained. The warlords remained. And the seeds of a new and even darker struggle had already been planted. The Soviets were gone. On that cold day in February 1989, as the last armored columns rolled across the Friendship Bridge and General Boris Gromov walked alone into Uzbekistan, Moscow declared the war finished. But for Afghanistan, it was not an ending, it was the opening of another chapter, one drenched in betrayal, chaos, and the kind of violence that leaves scars for generations. The Mujahideen, who had once been united in their holy war against the Soviets, now looked at each other with suspicion. Their common enemy had vanished. What remained were rival factions, tribal allegiances, and mountains of weapons supplied during Operation Cyclone. Instead of laying down their arms, commanders began sharpening them against one another. Kabul, once battered but still standing during the Soviet war, now became the prize. Mujahideen groups that had fought side by side now turned their artillery on the capital. rockets rained down indiscriminately, reducing neighborhoods to rubble. Civilians who had survived a decade of Soviet bombs now faced an even crueler fate, being torn apart by the very men they had once called liberators. Among the most infamous was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the same warlord Pakistan's ISI had favored during Operation Cyclone. His Hezb-e-Islami faction bombarded Kabul relentlessly, hoping to seize control. Other groups, equally ruthless, fought back. Streets that had once echoed with Soviet boots now shook under civil war. Afghans fled in droves. By the mid-1990s, millions had left their homeland, filling refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran. Children grew up behind barbed wire, hearing only the stories of war. In some of those camps, new ideas began to take root, ideas that would change the world forever. It was in this chaos that the Taliban emerged. Born from the madrasas, religious schools, in Pakistan, the Taliban were students first, fighters later. They promised an end to warlordism, an end to corruption, an end to chaos. Where Mujahideen commanders enriched themselves with smuggling and extortion, the Taliban vowed to restore order through religious purity. They moved swiftly. In 1994, Taliban fighters swept across Kandahar, their black and white flags fluttering above pickup trucks bristling with guns. Villagers, weary of endless violence, welcomed them at first. The Taliban punished looters, cleared checkpoints, and imposed their rule with uncompromising severity. By 1996, they had captured Kabul, hanging the former president from a lamppost and declaring the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The war seemed to pause, but only on the surface. Underneath, a new storm was gathering. Among the men who found sanctuary under Taliban rule was a tall Saudi with a soft voice and fiery eyes, Osama bin Laden. During the Soviet war, he had been a financier, channeling money from wealthy donors in the Gulf to the Afghan resistance. He built guest houses, training camps, and a network of Arab volunteers who fought alongside the Mujahideen. To many, he was a marginal figure, one of countless supporters scattered across the Muslim world. But in the chaos of the 1990s, his vision sharpened. In Afghanistan, bin Laden transformed his network into Al-Qaeda, the base. No longer content with driving the Soviets from Muslim lands, he declared war on the West itself. To him, America was no longer just a distant superpower, it was the next occupier, the next empire to be humiliated. The irony was cruel. The same covert operation that had armed and trained the Mujahideen against the Soviets had indirectly created the conditions for Al-Qaeda to thrive. The stingers, the rifles, the billions of dollars, all of it had played a role in building a culture of war that could not be dismantled once the Soviets were gone. Meanwhile, Washington congratulated itself. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, shattered by economic stagnation, political reform, and yes, the humiliation of Afghanistan. In the halls of the CIA, Operation Cyclone was remembered as a triumph, a shadow war that helped bring down a superpower without costing American lives. But the aftershocks were still rippling. Afghanistan was left in ruins. Its institutions destroyed, its people displaced, its soil littered with mines. And in that vacuum, radicalism thrived. Throughout the 1990s, attacks linked to Al-Qaeda grew bolder. The 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center in New York. The 1998 bombings of US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. The 2000 attack on the USS Cole in Yemen. Each strike was a warning, a signal that the war America thought it had won was far from over. And then came September 11, 2001. When the towers fell in New York and smoke rose from the Pentagon, the ghosts of Afghanistan returned with brutal clarity. The hijackers had trained in camps built during the chaos after the Soviet war. The ideology that fueled them had been nourished in the madrasas of Pakistan, the same pipeline once used to funnel men into the Soviet fight. And the man who orchestrated it all, Osama bin Laden, had cut his teeth in the very jihad Operation Cyclone had sustained. Looking back, the contradictions are stark. Operation Cyclone had achieved its goal. The Soviets bled, humiliated, and driven out. Some argue it was the final nail in the coffin of the Soviet Empire. But its unintended consequences reshaped the world. Afghanistan was left not as a free nation, but as a battlefield carved by rival warlords, then seized by the Taliban, and finally turned into a safe haven for global terrorism. The same covert war that toppled one empire created the foundations for another confrontation, one that would draw America itself into the mountains of Afghanistan 20 years later. Imagine again those first convoys in 1979, Soviet tanks grinding into Kabul. The CIA's response seemed clever at the time: cheap, indirect, deniable. Suitcases of cash. Rifles smuggled through Pakistan. Training camps run in the shadows. It worked. But history is never simple. The weapons didn't vanish when the Soviets did. The fighters didn't retire when the war ended. The war simply changed shape, transformed, and returned. This is the legacy of Operation Cyclone, a triumph that turned into a tragedy, a victory that sowed the seeds of future wars. And so we ask, was it worth it? Did Operation Cyclone truly bring freedom, or did it create a storm that no one could ever control? That answer depends on where you stand. In Washington, it was hailed as genius. In Moscow, it was remembered as humiliation. But in Afghanistan, in the valleys scarred by mines and the cities reduced to rubble, the people know the truth, that they became the battlefield where empires played their games, and it was they who paid the price. Clapperboard outro, for YouTube. This was the story of Operation Cyclone, the CIA's secret war in Afghanistan. A war that toppled a superpower, but also unleashed forces that would shape the 21st century. If you found this deep dive fascinating, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more stories from the hidden wars of history, and let me know in the comments, do you think Operation Cyclone was America's greatest victory, or its most dangerous mistake? Until next time, remember, the shadows of history are never still. They move, they twist, and they shape the world we live in today.